Victorian London, 1865. The mirrored walls of the Countess of Ashworth's reception hall reflected the light of the gasoliers, failing to shield Marlene Beaumont from the oppressive weight of her family's disgrace. "Have you seen?" whispered Lady Pembroke. "The Beaumont girl has the audacity to attend. One should not bring the scent of insolvency to a civilized gathering." Marlene straightened her spine, forcing a steady demeanor, refusing to let her family's ruin conquer her pride. "No one would think less of you if," her brother Andrew began. "If I were to hide in the country?" she cut in, her eyes hardening. "No, brother, I may be poor, but I refuse to vanish entirely." A sudden hush fell. "The Duke of Alderton," announced the major domo. Richard Hartwell, the wealthiest and coldest bachelor in England, entered, radiating severe command. Marlene watched as the ton parted, giving way to the man whose fortune could crush her. She sought a quieter salon, only to confront Lord Ashworth, the primary creditor. "I might settle the mortgage on Winton Hall," Ashworth sneered, "if you publicly state your father's scandal was due to his foolishness." Marlene's eyes flashed with fury. "You will get your due, sir, but you will not get my integrity." Before Ashworth could retaliate, a precise voice spoke behind her. "My Lord Ashworth, a distasteful conversation." Richard Hartwell offered Marlene his arm. "Miss Beaumont, might I have the honor?" The hall froze. "I fear you have mistaken my desperate circumstances," Marlene managed. "I am not in the habit of making mistakes," he replied, his gaze unwavering. Compelled by the respect in his eyes, she placed her hand on his arm. "You have just guaranteed every gossip will speculate on my ruin," she murmured as he led her away. "I was under the impression I was merely escorting the most courageous woman in the room." The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones as Marlene returned home that night, the weight of what had transpired pressing against her chest like an iron corset. Andrew sat across from her in the darkness, his young face troubled in the flickering lamplight. Their younger sister, Emma, waited at their modest townhouse with Mrs. Pemberton, their elderly governess, spared from witnessing the full spectacle of society's cruelty. "The Duke of Alderton," Andrew said quietly, breaking the tense silence. "Marlene, do you realize what his attention could mean for us, for our family?" "It means nothing," Marlene replied sharply, though her voice carried less conviction than she intended. "Wealthy men don't rescue ruined women out of charity, brother. They collect debts of their own making. He saw an opportunity tonight, nothing more." But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't forget the way Richard Hartwell had looked at her, not with pity or contempt, but with something that resembled recognition, as if he'd seen past the scandal and the whispers to the woman beneath, to something that intrigued him. Inside their cramped parlor, Mrs. Pemberton waited anxiously by the dying fire. The woman had been with their family for 30 years, had watched Marlene grow from a spirited child into a woman hardened by circumstance and loss. "How terrible was it, dear?" she asked, her weathered hands clasped tight. "As expected," she said, removing her gloves with deliberate care. "The ton circled like vultures, waiting for me to break. Lady Pembroke led the assault with her usual venom. Though it ended unexpectedly, the Duke intervened when Lord Ashworth tried to corner me." Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened with surprise. "The Duke of Alderton defended you publicly?" "He offered his arm and escorted me away from Ashworth. The entire hall witnessed it." Marlene's voice hardened with suspicion. "Now they'll speculate endlessly about what the wealthiest bachelor in England wants from the desperate Beaumont girl." Emma appeared from the hallway, her young face bright with the kind of hope Marlene could no longer afford. "Perhaps he simply admires you, Marlene. Perhaps he sees what we see, your courage, your strength." "Men like Richard Hartwell don't act on admiration alone, Emma. They calculate, they strategize, and they always, always collect their debts." Marlene moved toward the stairs, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. "We should all be wary of dukes bearing kindness." Across London, in his elegant Mayfair townhouse, Richard Hartwell stood at his study window with a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. His steward, Mr. Collins, waited patiently by the mahogany desk, accustomed to his master's contemplative silences. "You've caused quite the stir tonight, Your Grace. The Ton will be discussing your defense of Miss Beaumont for weeks." "Let them discuss." Richard turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Collins, I need you to conduct a thorough investigation. Find out everything about the Beaumont family deaths, every creditor, every outstanding amount, every legal entanglement. I want a complete accounting within the week." Collins nodded, his curiosity evident. "And your intentions regarding Miss Beaumont, Your Grace?" Richard was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I intend to offer Miss Beaumont something far more valuable than pity or charity. I intend to offer her freedom and the choice to use it however she sees fit." 3 days passed with agonizing slowness, each one bringing Marlene closer to financial catastrophe. She spent her mornings at the small writing desk in her room, composing letters seeking employment, governess positions, companion roles, anything respectable that might provide income. Each afternoon brought rejections, politely worded but unmistakably clear. No one wanted to employ a Beaumont. Her family's scandal was too fresh, too public, too damaging to risk association. The debts pressed closer with every passing hour. Mr. Dalton, their banker, had been explicit during his last visit. £300 by month's end, or seizure proceedings would begin immediately. £300 might as well have been 3,000 for all the hope Marlene had of obtaining it. "We could sell Mother's jewelry," Emma suggested hesitantly one evening, her voice small in the dimly lit parlor. "The emerald necklace alone might fetch enough to—" "No," Marlene's voice was iron. "That necklace is the only inheritance you and Andrew have. It's the last piece of Mother we possess. I won't let them take that, too." Mrs. Pemberton wrung her hands anxiously. "But dear, we have no other options. The creditors won't wait much longer, and if Mr. Dalton begins seizure proceedings—" "There's always another option," Marlene insisted, though she had no idea what it might be. "I simply need time to find it." That night, she lay awake in the narrow bed she now shared with Emma, calculating impossible figures in her mind, watching fog drift past the window like the ghosts of better days. Her father's disgrace had been complete and devastating, a fraudulent railway investment scheme that had destroyed not only their family, but a dozen other respectable families as well. Society had branded him a fool at best, a willing conspirator at worst, and his children bore that stain like a birthmark, indelible and damning.
Meanwhile, across London, in his private study, Richard Hartwell sat reviewing the documents his solicitors had compiled with meticulous detail. The Beaumont debts were extensive, but far from insurmountable for a man of his means. Lord Ashworth held the largest single claim, nearly £800, and Richard noted with professional interest that the legal documentation appeared deeply flawed. "Your Grace," Collins said carefully, setting down another folder, "if I may ask, why this particular interest in Miss Beaumont? There are many families in financial distress." Richard was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "2 years ago, at the Duchess of Marlborough's garden party, I watched Miss Beaumont argue voting reform with Lord Cheswick and 3 of his associates. She was outnumbered, outranked, and surrounded by men twice her age with 10 times her social standing, and she didn't back down an inch. She presented her arguments with logic and passion, refusing to be intimidated or dismissed. I found it remarkable. And now, Your Grace, now I've seen that same spirit tested by true adversity, by public humiliation and financial ruin. She stood before Lord Ashworth with nothing but her dignity as armor, and she didn't break, Collins. She didn't bend or beg or compromise." Richard's expression was unreadable. That kind of unbroken will is rarer than diamonds, and far more valuable.
4 days after the reception, on a gray morning that matched Marlene's mood, a sealed envelope arrived by special messenger. Mrs. Pemberton's hands trembled as she brought it to Marlene in the cramped parlor, her face pale with apprehension. "This just came, dear. I don't understand." Marlene broke the unmarked seal with fingers that weren't quite steady. Inside was a bank draft for £350 and a single line written in elegant masculine script. "For immediate necessities, from one who respects courage." The paper slipped from Marlene's fingers, fluttering to the worn carpet. £350, exactly enough to pay Mr. Dalton, with a small buffer remaining. The precision was too calculated to be mere coincidence, too exact to be anything but deliberate. "Who sent it?" Emma breathed, appearing in the doorway, hope lighting her face like a candle in darkness. "It's unsigned." Marlene's mind raced through possibilities, though she already knew the answer. "But the draft is drawn on Coote's Bank, the Duke's Bank." Andrew picked up the draft, examining the heavy paper with its official seals. "It wants you to know it came from him while maintaining the fiction of anonymity. It's clever." "Of course it's clever." Marlene began pacing the small room like a caged animal. "An unsigned gift creates obligation without explicit terms. I'll be bound to him through gratitude rather than contract, indebted by social expectation rather than legal law. And when he eventually names his price, because he will name his price, I'll have already accepted his money, making refusal far more difficult." "Does it really matter?" Emma pressed, her voice rising with desperation. "Marlene, this money saves us. We can pay Mr. Dalton, keep the house, have food on the table. We can breathe again." But Marlene saw the trap with crystal clarity. The Duke was playing a sophisticated game, establishing debt through apparent generosity, binding her through the silk cords of social expectation rather than the iron chains of legal contract. It was manipulation dressed in kindness. It's elegant manipulation, and I'm being forced to accept it.
Mrs. Pemberton's expression was pained. "Child, sometimes we must accept help when it's offered, regardless of the source or the potential cost. If you can't stand people who exploit others' desperation for their own gain, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type, "Nobody deserves that." Because what happened next only got worse. Help always has conditions, especially from men as powerful as the Duke of Alderton. Yet, even as Marlene spoke the words, doubt crept in around the edges. She remembered the respect in Richard's eyes when he'd escorted her from the salon, the cold fury in his voice when dismissing Lord Ashworth. Was it possible his motives were more complex than simple manipulation? Was she being too suspicious or not suspicious enough? The practical reality remained inescapable. They needed this money desperately. Mr. Dalton had made his ultimatum clear. Without payment, they would lose everything. "We'll accept it," Marlene finally decided, the words tasting like defeat. "But I'll repay every single penny. I won't remain in the Duke's debt any longer than absolutely necessary. I'll find a way." She deposited the money the next morning and paid Mr. Dalton that very afternoon, watching his predatory smile fade with grim satisfaction. But walking home through London's crowded, indifferent streets, Marlene couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a bargain whose true cost she didn't yet understand and might not be able to afford when the bill finally came due.
The invitation arrived 2 days later, delivered on heavy cream paper with the Duke's seal and dark blue wax, formal, prestigious, and utterly unavoidable. The Duke of Alderton requested the honor of escorting Miss Beaumont to the Royal Academy's summer exhibition on Thursday afternoon. "It's not really a request," Marlene told Mrs. Pemberton, staring at the elegant script. "The entire ton will know of this invitation within hours. Refusing would be not only impossible, but insulting. He's backed me into a corner." She dressed carefully in her mother's best gown, a deep green silk that was only slightly outdated, and waited in their shabby parlor. When Richard Hartwell arrived precisely on time, his severe elegance made their threadbare furniture look even more pathetic by contrast. "Miss Beaumont," he greeted her with a slight bow, "thank you for accepting my invitation. I wasn't aware I had much choice in the matter. Your gift was rather insistent in establishing my obligation to you." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or approval. "I prefer to think of it as offering options where none previously existed. You mean creating obligations where none were requested or desired." The Royal Academy's galleries were crowded with London's elite, the air thick with expensive perfume and competitive conversation. Marlene felt every stare like a physical weight, heard every whisper like a knife against her skin. The Duke of Alderton and the disgraced Beaumont girl. What did it mean? What did he want from her? Richard seemed entirely unbothered by the attention, his hand firm and steady under her elbow as he guided her through the crowded rooms toward the paintings. "You're aware this will only increase speculation about your intentions," Marlene said quietly, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I'm aware that your company is worth considerably more than the ton's speculation." Despite her wariness and suspicion, Marlene found herself drawn into conversation as they moved through the galleries. The Duke was genuinely educated and perceptive, offering insights into the artwork that revealed a sophisticated understanding of composition and technique. He noticed when she lingered on a particular landscape, remembered details she'd mentioned in passing. It was profoundly unsettling to be seen so clearly by someone she'd dismissed as merely calculating. Then Lady Pembroke materialized from the crowd, her smile as sharp as broken glass. "Duke Alderton, what a delightful surprise to see you here with such unexpected company." Richard's posture shifted subtly, became colder and more dangerous. "Lady Pembroke, I trust your husband's shipping investments are recovering from last quarter's volatility." The woman's smile faltered visibly. Yes, they're quite stable, thank you. Excellent. I'm relieved to hear it. His tone was pleasant, but the threat underneath was unmistakable. I'd hate for you to experience the kind of financial uncertainty that teaches one humility. Market conditions can change so rapidly, as I'm sure you're aware. One careless word in the wrong ear, and even the most established fortunes can find themselves suddenly vulnerable to the opinions of others. Lady Pembroke's face went pale as milk. She murmured something incoherent and retreated into the crowd like a wounded animal seeking cover. Marlene stared at the Duke with a mixture of shock and reluctant admiration. Did you just threaten her family's financial stability? Richard said calmly, guiding her toward another painting. People who enjoy publicly humiliating others should remember they're not immune to reversal of fortune themselves.
You can't intimidate everyone in London who whispers about my family. Can't I? He turned to look at her fully, and Marlene found herself trapped by the intensity of his gaze. Miss Beaumont, you seem to labor under the misapprehension that I'm playing at chivalry for amusement. I assure you, my interest in your well-being is entirely genuine and thoroughly calculated. Both things can be true simultaneously. That's precisely what concerns me, Marlene said. Men like you don't do anything without expecting a substantial return on your investment. Perhaps I simply appreciate that you're the only person in all of London who dared to refuse a powerful man's demands when submission would have been infinitely easier and more profitable. That kind of integrity is rare enough to be valuable in its own right. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and unspoken meaning. Marlene felt her carefully maintained defenses begin to crack, ever so slightly. The formal request to call upon her arrived the next morning, delivered with the same ceremony as the previous invitation. Marlene dressed in her most severe gown, armor in the form of high collars and tight sleeves, and received the Duke in their shabby parlor with Mrs. Pemberton as chaperone. Richard Hartwell looked absurdly out of place among their threadbare furniture and faded wallpaper, but he declined tea politely and got straight to business with characteristic directness. Miss Beaumont, I sent you the money to pay your immediate debts. I want to be completely clear about that fact. Marlene's suspicions crystallized into certainty. And now you'll name your price for such generosity. I will. He leaned forward slightly, his expression utterly serious. I want you to agree to a formal courtship with the explicit understanding that it will lead to marriage. In exchange, I will settle all your family's remaining debts, approximately £1,500 total, and restore Winton Hall to your siblings' ownership. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. From the hallway, Marlene heard Emma's small gasp. Her sister had been eavesdropping, as expected. Mrs. Pemberton's teacup rattled audibly against its saucer. "You're purchasing a wife," Marlene said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. You need financial security and social rehabilitation. I need a wife who possesses qualities far rarer than social standing or aristocratic bloodlines: integrity, courage, and the ability to stand firm under tremendous pressure. We're both practical people, Miss Beaumont. This makes logical sense for both parties. If you believe marriage should be based on genuine respect, not financial desperation, hit that subscribe button. People like Lord Ashworth won't, and you need to hear what she did about it." "It makes sense as a business transaction," Marlene said, fury beginning to shake her voice despite her best efforts at control. You're offering to buy my family's way out of ruin in exchange for my lifelong compliance and submission. That's not a marriage proposal, Your Grace. That's purchasing livestock at market."
Richard's expression hardened. "I'm offering you a practical way out of an impossible situation that has no other solution. You're offering me a gilded cage." Marlene stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You think because you admire my spirit that it somehow makes this arrangement less fundamentally insulting. You want to marry me specifically for my defiance and independence, but only on the condition that I submit entirely to your terms. Do you not see the glaring contradiction in that position? I see a woman whose stubborn pride is preventing her from accepting the help she desperately needs and her family deserves." "Then you see incorrectly, Your Grace." Marlene's voice turned to ice. "I need help, yes. I'm desperately poor and socially ruined. But I need my self-respect even more. I won't become your well-kept charity case. I won't be the courageous woman you collect like one of those paintings in the Academy, something interesting and slightly unusual to display to prove your discerning taste and sophisticated judgment." Mrs. Pemberton made a small sound of distress. Richard looked genuinely shocked, as if he'd never anticipated her refusal as a possibility. "Miss Beaumont, you're being profoundly unreasonable. £1,500 could save your entire family." "Will cost me everything I actually am," she finished sharply. "I will not marry for money, Your Grace, not even to save my family from ruin. I will find another way, somehow. Good day." She moved to the door, opening it in unmistakable dismissal. For a long moment, Richard simply stared at her, genuine pain flickering across his severe features. Then he rose stiffly, gave a formal bow, and left without another word.
Emma burst into tears the very moment the door closed behind the Duke. "Marlene, what have you done? He was offering us everything. Winton Hall, freedom from debt, social rehabilitation, everything." "He was offering us a price," Marlene said quietly, though her own hands were trembling violently. "And I'm worth more than that. We're all worth more than that." Mrs. Pemberton looked utterly stricken. "Child, think of your siblings. Think of Winton Hall and your family's future. Think of Andrew's prospects, Emma's chances for a decent marriage. You've just thrown it all away." "I am thinking of them." Marlene climbed the stairs slowly toward her small room. "What lesson would I teach Emma? That women should sell themselves to the highest bidder when times get difficult? That integrity and self-respect are luxuries to be discarded the moment money appears? No, I'll find another way." But doubt gnawed at her with sharp teeth as she lay awake that night. Had pride just destroyed their only realistic chance at salvation? Many women in her desperate position would have leaped at the Duke's extraordinarily generous offer without a moment's hesitation. Perhaps she was simply a fool. Perhaps pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, an indulgence that would doom her siblings along with herself.
Yet the thought of accepting Richard Hartwell's proposal, of spending the rest of her life knowing she'd been purchased like a solution to a mathematical problem, made her feel physically ill. The weeks that followed were absolute torture. The anonymous money the Duke had sent kept them precariously afloat for a time, but it was steadily running out. Marlene's employment applications continued to meet universal rejection. Her family's scandal preceded her everywhere, closing every door before she could even knock. Lord Ashworth, sensing her increasing vulnerability like a predator scenting blood, began to circle more aggressively. His notes became more frequent, his threats less veiled and more explicit. He knew the money was depleting rapidly. He knew she had nowhere left to turn, no options remaining. Andrew tried desperately to find work, was similarly blocked at every turn. Emma grew thin with constant worry. Mrs. Pemberton looked older and more worn each passing day, the weight of their situation crushing her spirit. "You could write to the Duke," Emma suggested, one particularly desperate evening, her voice small. "Apologize for your harsh words. Accept his offer. It's not too late." "No," Marlene said firmly, though her resolve was cracking like ice under pressure. "I made my choice. I have to live with it." But at night, lying awake in the darkness, she questioned everything. Had she let stubborn pride destroy her family's last hope? Was her personal integrity worth Emma's future, worth Andrew's prospects, worth condemning them all to poverty and disgrace?
The summons to Lady Harrington's grand ball was not an invitation, but an ultimatum, delivered in Lord Ashworth's distinctly menacing handwriting. The message was brutally explicit. Appear before society, where seizure proceedings would begin the very next morning. There would be no further extensions, no more negotiations. Marlene wore her mother's best gown for what felt like the final time, and walked into that glittering ballroom like a prisoner approaching her own execution. The ton watched with barely concealed predatory anticipation, sensing the kill was imminent. She found Lord Ashworth holding court near the terrace doors, surrounded by his usual cronies and sycophants. He smiled when he saw her approach, a cruel, victorious expression that made her skin crawl with revulsion. "Miss Beaumont, how extraordinarily good of you to join us this evening." He gestured expansively to his assembled companions. "Gentlemen, you all remember Miss Beaumont, I trust? Her late father was quite the financial innovator in his day, particularly innovative in his remarkable methods of losing other people's money." Cruel laughter rippled through the group like poison spreading through water. Marlene remained absolutely still, her face a carefully constructed mask of composure. "I've come as you requested, Lord Ashworth. Please state your terms clearly so we can conclude this business." "How delightfully direct you are, my dear. Very well, then. I want full payment of your family's outstanding debt, £1,200 by week's end. If you cannot produce this sum, which we both know you cannot, I will immediately seize your remaining assets. This includes, most particularly, that lovely emerald necklace your dear departed mother left you."
The necklace. Emma's most treasured inheritance, the one piece of their mother she clung to desperately. Marlene felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "That necklace is not part of any secured debt," she said, her voice barely steady. "You have no legal claim to it whatsoever." "I have a substantial debt, and a debtor with absolutely no means to pay," Ashworth countered, leaning uncomfortably close, his breath hot and sour at her ear. "The courts will inevitably favor my position, unless you publicly apologize for your father's criminal incompetence and acknowledge his utter foolishness before this entire assembly. Humiliate yourself and your family name thoroughly enough, and I might possibly consider more lenient terms." The ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath, the ton waiting with barely contained excitement for Marlene Beaumont to finally, completely break before them. "Never," she whispered,
her voice trembling but defiant. "Then prepare to lose absolutely everything, my dear girl, including that pathetic, stubborn pride you cling to so desperately. Integrity over everything if you're Team Marlene. The manipulation can't win. Now watch what happens when she finally gets the defense she deserves." A cold, cutting voice sliced through the tension like a perfectly honed blade through silk. "I'm afraid, Lord Ashworth, that you've made a rather significant legal error in your assumptions." Richard Hartwell emerged from the crowd with deliberate steps, carrying an expensive leather portfolio under his arm.
"Your Grace," Ashworth blustered, his confidence wavering slightly, "this is a private financial matter." "It ceased being private the moment you chose to conduct it publicly before assembled witnesses," Richard interrupted with icy precision. "And it's about to become considerably more public if you persist in pursuing this fraudulent claim." "Fraudulent?" Ashworth's face reddened with anger and fear. "I have every legal right." "You have nothing whatsoever." Richard opened the portfolio with deliberate care, removing several official-looking documents. "I've spent the past 3 weeks working closely with my solicitors, reviewing every single aspect of Mr. Beaumont's debts in exhaustive detail. Did you know that the original loan you purchased from Barings Bank was improperly transferred? The documentation was never properly filed with the Court of Chancery, as explicitly required by law. Which means, Lord Ashworth, that your claim to this particular debt is completely invalid." The color drained from Ashworth's face like water from a broken vessel. "You're lying! You must be!" "I have all the evidence right here. Would you like me to read it aloud to this distinguished assembly? Or perhaps we should discuss how you've been systematically charging interest rates that significantly exceed the legal maximum. That particular violation alone could see you prosecuted for usury under current statutes." Ashworth looked around wildly for support from his cronies, but they had all melted away into the crowd like morning fog. The ton loved a good scandal, but they loved being on the winning side even more.
"This isn't over," Ashworth hissed desperately, his voice shaking. "Yes," Richard said with absolute, crushing finality. "It most certainly is. If you continue harassing Miss Beaumont or any member of her family, I will not only pursue aggressive legal action regarding your fraudulent claims, but I will also make it my personal mission to have my solicitors audit every single business dealing you've ever conducted. I suspect strongly that we'll find considerably more irregularities. Do you understand me perfectly, Lord Ashworth?" Ashworth stared at the Duke with naked, impotent hatred, then turned and stalked from the ballroom in humiliated defeat, his cronies scattering before him. The silence that followed was absolutely profound. Then, slowly, the ton began whispering among themselves, the narrative already shifting like sand in wind. The Duke of Alderton had publicly defended Marlene Beaumont. That changed absolutely everything about her social position. Marlene stood frozen, her mind desperately struggling to process what had just happened. Richard had saved her, rescued her completely, but not with money. He'd saved her with respect. Respect for her family's legal rights, respect for her explicitly stated desire not to simply be purchased out of her troubles. "Miss Beaumont," Richard turned to her, and for the first time since she'd rejected his proposal, she saw genuine uncertainty in his normally confident eyes. "Might I possibly have a word with you in private?" They found privacy in Lady Harrington's well-appointed library, the sounds of the ball muted to a distant hum by thick oak doors and heavy curtains. Marlene stood by the tall window overlooking the garden, her heart pounding so violently she thought Richard must surely hear it. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "for what you did out there. I don't fully understand why you did it, but thank you." "Don't you understand?" Richard moved closer, but stopped at a carefully respectful distance. "Marlene, I need to apologize to you, sincerely and completely. When I made you that proposal several weeks ago, I genuinely thought I was being practical and straightforward. I didn't realize I was being profoundly, insultingly wrong." She turned to him, facing fully. "You were trying to help my family." "I was trying to solve a problem," he corrected firmly. "I treated your desperate situation like a financial equation to be efficiently balanced. I didn't properly consider that what you actually needed wasn't money, but someone who would fight for your rights and dignity, rather than simply paying to make your problems conveniently disappear." "The anonymous money you sent?" "Was manipulative, and I apologize for that as well. It was anonymous specifically because I knew you wouldn't accept it otherwise, which means I was deliberately circumventing your clearly expressed wishes." He took a careful breath. "Marlene, when I saw you refuse Lord Ashworth at that reception, when I watched you stand alone and tell a powerful man that you could have your money but never your integrity, do you know what I actually saw? I saw someone who genuinely values her personal integrity more than her physical comfort. Someone who would rather suffer real hardship than compromise her fundamental principles."
"It's the rarest quality I've ever encountered in anyone." "And you wanted to marry it," Marlene said softly, understanding dawning. "You wanted to possess that quality." "I wanted to marry you," Richard corrected gently, "but I went about it entirely, catastrophically wrong. I tried to buy your hand when what I should have done from the beginning was prove that I was genuinely worthy of it. I should have shown you through actions that I truly respect your strength and independence, not tried to make you financially dependent on mine." Marlene felt something deep in her chest crack open, something she'd kept locked and guarded since her father's death and disgrace. Hope, perhaps, or possibly the fragile beginning of genuine trust. "Why did you spend 3 entire weeks researching obscure legal documents after I rejected you so harshly? You could simply have walked away. Most men would have." "Because your rejection made me realize something crucial. I was genuinely in love with you." The words hung suspended in the air between them. Richard's expression was completely raw, more vulnerable than she'd ever witnessed. "When you refused my proposal, Marlene, when you explicitly told me you wouldn't sell yourself even to save your family from complete ruin, you proved that everything I'd thought about your character was absolutely true. You have an unbroken will, Marlene, an unbreakable core of integrity. And the profound fact that you used that formidable will to reject me, specifically because I was trying to break it with money, made me realize that I don't want to own your magnificent spirit. I want to stand beside it as an equal partner." Tears burned hot behind Marlene's eyes. "I don't need you to save me, Richard. I know that now. And that's precisely why I want to be with you." He reached carefully for her hand, his touch remarkably gentle. "I'm not proposing a transaction anymore, Marlene. I'm proposing a genuine partnership between equals."
"You'll keep your complete independence, your strong voice, You're absolute right to tell me when I'm being an arrogant fool, which will probably be frequently. I'll never again try to buy your compliance. All I'm asking is that you consider whether we might build something meaningful together, something based fundamentally on mutual respect rather than mutual financial need. Marlene looked down at their joined hands, then slowly up at his face. She saw absolute sincerity there, and genuine vulnerability, and something that looked remarkably like real love. "I'm still poor," she said carefully. "My family is still wrapped in public scandal. I come with nothing but pride and ongoing problems. You come with courage, remarkable intelligence, and a spirit that refuses to break even when it probably should for practical reasons. That's worth infinite more than any monetary dowry could ever be." She thought carefully about the life she could potentially have if she said yes. Not a life of dependence and obligation, but a true partnership with a man who had conclusively proven through actions that he valued her character far more than his ability to control her circumstances. "If I agree to this," Marlene said slowly, testing each word, "I want some very specific conditions of my own." Richard smiled, and the expression completely transformed his normally severe face. "Name every single one of them." "Winton Hall goes directly to Andrew, not to you or your estate. Whatever debts remain after your legal maneuvering, we tackle together with complete financial transparency. And if I ever think you're trying to manage me like one of your business investments, I reserve the absolute right to argue with you until you finally see reason." Agreed enthusiastically on all counts. Anything else? Marlene took a deep, steadying breath. "Promise me that you'll never stop respecting the fact that I said no to you initially, that you'll always remember I chose you ultimately not because I needed financial rescue, but because I genuinely wanted an equal partner." Richard lifted her hand carefully to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "I promise you, Marlene, every single day I will remember that you are with me by free choice, not desperate necessity. That your yes means something profound and real precisely because you were strong enough to say no first."
"Then yes," Marlene whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll marry you, Richard." He kissed her then, and it felt like genuine victory, not over her difficult circumstances, but over all the forces that had tried so hard to break her spirit entirely. When they finally pulled apart, Marlene found herself smiling authentically for many long months. "The ton is going to have an absolute field day with this development," she observed. "Let them talk endlessly." Richard tucked a loose strand of hair tenderly behind her ear. "Let them all see clearly that the courageous Miss Beaumont chose the Duke of Alderton freely, not the other way around. Let them witness that genuine spirit and personal honor can triumph completely over public scandal and crushing debt." Through the library's tall windows, Marlene could see the lights of London spread before them, the same vast city that had watched her fall so dramatically and had fully expected her to break under pressure. But she hadn't broken. She'd bent dangerously close, had nearly shattered completely, but ultimately she'd held firm to herself and her principles. And now, standing beside a man who genuinely valued her strength rather than trying to subdue it or purchase it, she finally understood what true partnership actually meant. Not rescue or salvation or charity, but two people consciously choosing to face an uncertain world together, each one making the other immeasurably stronger. Richard offered her his arm with quiet formality. "Shall we return to the ball and give them all something truly substantial to discuss?" Marlene took his arm firmly, her head held high,
her spirit genuinely unbroken. Yes, let's do exactly that. They walked back into the crowded ballroom together, and if the ton whispered and speculated wildly, Marlene discovered she no longer cared at all. She'd successfully defended her integrity, maintained her hard-won pride, and found a love that respected both completely. Against seemingly impossible odds, she'd won entirely on her own terms.